It is really good to be here and to have the opportunity to talk about the Gospels with you all. And so just out of curiosity, how many of you ever heard of a Christian gospel before? Okay, good, yay, okay. How many of you have ever read one before? Okay, good. How many of you have never heard of anything related to the Christian Gospels before? Okay, good, okay. So I'm hoping that I'm not taking sort of a too basic an approach to what I'm doing. So if just sort of let me speed up or tell me to speed up or something if you think that is I'm going too slow. But I am going to be fairly technical, and that's really the reason why I wanted you to have the handouts. I'm going to kind of give an overview of the Gospels and how we understand them. But also take a look at the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke to sort of see how they craft their Gospels. Again, my title is Not Your Parents' Gospel, and so historicity, which is a fancy word, literary license in the crafting of the Gospel. So hopefully that will be something that will be of interest to you. My goal is to share how New Testament scholars generally understand the canonical Gospels of Christianity in light of questions about history and truth as we in the 21st century generally think about those two terms. In terms of history, let me stress that Jesus and his disciples and followers are one among several sects of Judaism in the first century. We know from Josephus, so something outside the scriptures. He's a Jewish historian of the late first century who came from Galilee, went over to the Roman side after the destruction of the temple and so on. So he identifies about six different groups of types of Judaism in the first century. So one is the Samaritans. They are descendants of the northern kingdom of Israel that was destroyed in the 8th century before the Common Era. So if I use BCE and CE, will you all know what I'm talking about? Okay, good. Yay, okay, good. So interestingly enough, Samaritans still exist. There's 2 small villages or towns of them in the West Bank in Palestine, even today. So they were part of the northern kingdom, and you may have heard the story of the Samaritan woman from the Gospel of John. Another group that has gotten a lot of airplay are the Essenes. They are the community that we think lived at Qumran. So that's where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. The Dead Sea Scrolls are texts of the Hebrew Bible, so the Old Testament for Christianity, as well as some additional texts that are unique to that particular community. They moved to the desert when they got mad about the high priest. This is during the Hasmonean monarchy, so in the 2nd century before the Common Era. And so that's another group that continued into Jesus' time. They disappeared once the temple was destroyed because there was no longer any need for them to be mad about the high priest because the high priest couldn't do anything anyway since there was no temple left. Second, another group that is perhaps more familiar and that we do actually find in the Gospel. So the Essenes are not in the Gospel, Samaritans are the Sadducees. And they too are associated with the temple cult. They represent the aristocracy. They make up a good portion of the Sanhedrin, which is the council, the Jewish council, if you will. They did not believe in the resurrection, so that's one of the points of disagreement. But they too disappear from view once the temple is destroyed by Rome in 70 CE. So the Sadducees and the Essenes are 2 of the groups that kind of disappear. Another group are the Zealots, and how many of you have read Reza Aslan's book, The Zealots? Anybody? He does raise an interesting question about what zealots are and who they are, or at least has brought that to a much more common awareness than we knew for a long time. There are 2 big revolts that the zealots are at least partially responsible for or involved in. One is indeed the Jewish War that takes place between 66 and 73 CE that results at 70 CE in the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. 73 is when Masada is destroyed. And then the second revolt is the Bar Kokhba revolt that takes place in the 130s, and that's the point at which, after the Romans squash that particular revolt, then that's the point at which Jews are expelled from Israel/Palestine and don't come back to Israel until the 1940s. So, and that's the Zealot group, and of course after the conclusion of the Bar Kokhba revolt, they disappear from history as well too. So there's two more groups to go. One is the Pharisees. These, again, if you've read the Gospels, are famous, pretty common folks. They are portrayed as the primary opponents of Jesus in the canonical Gospels, but they probably originated during the exile in Babylonia in the 6th century before the Common Era. So they go all the way back to Judea being taken captive and to Persia. To Babylon, and then they are allowed to return when Cyrus and the Persian Empire overtake the Babylonians. Part of what they had to do when they were in Babylon was to figure out, well, what do we do about the cult, given that the temple is destroyed and given that we are hundreds of miles away from home. And they began to figure out a way to live out the Torah without the need for the temple to be in place. And so that experience that they had during the Babylonian exile, when the first temple is destroyed, they draw upon and recreate when the second temple is destroyed, and they become the group of rabbis. So if you are familiar with the rabbinic writings, with the Talmud and so on, the Pharisees, we think, transitioned into the rabbis, the rabbinic group, and that becomes the group that shapes modern day Judaism. So the Pharisees are important, and they, to some extent, still exist in the form of Judaism in the Common Era. And then finally, there are followers of Jesus of Nazareth. So they are not Christians in the biblical texts. They are followers of Jesus. They are a Jewish reform movement in the 1st century. And Jesus is a Jew. All the disciples are are Jews. Paul is a Jew. So it's not until this interest in who this Jesus of Nazareth is begins to spread outside of Israel, and it's not really until the temple is destroyed that people begin to think, well, maybe it's okay if people don't need to become Jewish in order to become followers of Jesus. And so it's quite late. The first time we actually hear any use of the term Christian is in the book of Acts, which we think is written in the early part of the 2nd century and comes out of the community in Antioch, we think. So that's the first time that anybody's called Christian. Also, Pliny the Younger uses Christus as a way to describe some people in his province of Bithynia that he's a little bit troubled by, and has to write to the emperor to say, what do we do about these people? So that's an extra biblical reference that indicates that there were people who were somehow related to this Jesus of Nazareth, who becomes known as the Christ in the early part of the 2nd century. Whew. Okay, so that's a little bit about the groups of which the followers of Jesus are a part, so again, very much embedded in Judaism. So let me talk a little bit about the Gospels and about what they are. So gospel is an English word that comes from an older English word, God's spell. So how many of you have seen the musical Godspell? Okay, I'm dating myself, right? But so that's the contraction is gospel. It translates the Greek word euangelion, which we also would translate as good message or good news. So the Gospels, therefore, tell us good news about a person known as Jesus of Nazareth. And there are 4 canonical Gospels that are accepted as authoritative by the Church in the 4th century: Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And that's the chronological order in which the majority of scholars believe they are written, as opposed to the theological issue, or the theological order that you would find in the New Testament. So again, Mark we think is the oldest one. It's written sometime around the destruction of the Jerusalem temple by Rome in 70 CE, so sometimes it's dated a little bit before, sometimes a little bit later. I would move it towards the later side. And it's debated where it might have been written from, because the author was initially thought to be John Mark, the secretary of Peter. That's why the Rome association began to be developed, but it may be that it's actually somewhere in sort of in the Syro-Phoenicia area, so the part of the Levant that's just north of Israel proper. Matthew is and Luke are sort of about the same time. Matthew's written probably in the mid-80s to the 90s. Again, so after the destruction of the temple. The reason we date Mark first is because the angst about the destruction of the temple appears to be much more significant in Mark than it is in Matthew. It's still there, but the community is beginning to think through how are we living now that we're past that terrible event. So, and it's usually associated or thought to have been written in Antioch in Syria. Luke Acts is a 2-volume work, so there's the Gospel and then there's the Book of Acts. So the Gospel is about Jesus, and the Book of Acts is about the creation of the church, or the post-resurrection, post-Pentecost community. Again, Luke we think is maybe the 80s or the 90s. Acts we think is after the turn of the 2nd century, and so there's a space of time between them, but we connect them because they are addressed to the same person. The language is much the same between the two books, and so and you can see themes that are begun in the Gospel that are carried through into the Book of Acts. So that's why we put them together, and most scholars will indicate that it is a 2-volume work. And then the 4th Gospel, the one that we think is the oldest, or the newest, I should say, is the Gospel of John, written probably in the 90s. There's some sense that, which is under discussion right at the moment, about whether followers of Jesus were ejected out of synagogues in the around 90, and so there's some debate about that. But clearly, this particular community had trouble with those other folks. So it's sort of like in some Christian communities where people get mad at the pastor and they pick up and they take a portion of the congregation with them and they set up down the street, and it becomes the third church of whatever as opposed to the first church of whatever. And so in some ways we think that is similar to what may have happened in John's community. And so that one is probably also written in Asia Minor. In Ephesus is one of the places that it is associated with. And the first 3 are, we sometimes talk about the synoptic gospels. Is that a familiar term to folks? It's the idea that you can see with the same eye, so they clearly have some literary relationship to one another. Yes, question?
Just out of curiosity, how were the scholars able to determine the dates when the Gospels were written?
Well, we fudge a lot, but a lot of it is based on the language that's used. It's based on what some of the factors are and how immediate or far away they seem to be. So, for example, the destruction of the temple is clearly the big event that everybody has to deal with. And so how immediate that experience is one of the tools that we use to think about, well, how would we date this particular gospel in light of that major event? So, yeah.
And then one little thing I'd like to clear up. Did Jesus ever say he was not Jewish? Is that, kind of confuses me?
Jesus never talked about not being Jewish.
Okay, so, he because when I was self-talking with some of my Christian friends, I get kind of confused.
Yeah, Jesus is Jewish. Never plans to be anything else, at least from what we can tell. Sir?
I assume these people got their information from oral tradition. Is there a suspicion that maybe they had some manuscripts that were...
We are going to be talking about that, so stay tuned. Yay. Okay, good. Sir?
Was Jesus literate? Did he write anything? No. Did he ever write anything?
Well, we don't know. is the answer to that question. Given the way in which he's portrayed, he seems to have been fairly cognizant or aware of the scriptures and so on. So, but there's no indication of whether he did or didn't. Now, if he and his dad really were a carpenter shop next door to one of the biggest market towns in the Galilee, Sepphoris, which interestingly enough is not mentioned at all in the Gospels, then they would have known Greek because that was the language of commerce, and so there would have been some expectation that they were familiar with.
Because much of what he spoke Aramaic, correct?
Well, again, we don't know. So, yep.
Yeah, but wasn't Greek, ancient Greek, the lingua franca of that era?
Koine Greek, not as opposed to Attic Greek. So it's
So he would more likely have spoken Greek rather than Aramaic, which...
So all we know for sure is that the biblical texts are written in Greek. Are written in Koine Greek, which is sort of the newspaper Greek of that period. So it's not the same kind of Greek that Homer used. So it's not classical Greek. So it has Hellenistic Hellenistic influences in terms of it.
My point has nothing to do with Mel Gibson's interpretation of anything. Completely wrong on this backwards. Sorry.
Yes, yeah. That was an interesting, well, we can talk about that during the question and answer period. But anyway, yeah, that was fun. Okay, let's not go there. Okay, so one of the other pieces that it's important to know about, and this goes to the what we know or don't know about did Jesus write anything or anything like that, is anytime you pick up a copy of a gospel in a Bible and open it up and start to read it, you need to be aware that that is biblical scholars' best guess of what might have actually been happening then, because we have no original manuscripts. So the way in which the biblical texts are actually put together is that groups of scholars kind of put their heads together and they look at the various manuscripts that we have, the earliest of which is not really until the 4th century where we have a complete text. So Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus are quite late, the 4th century, so in the 300s, in the 5th century, in the 400s. And actually, we'll have a picture a little bit later of the Freer Logion. So here in the DC area, we have one of the great treasures in biblical scholarship, which are the Freer codexes, the Bible codexes, which includes a gospel book in which there is a unique ending to the Gospel of Mark. So that no other manuscript tradition that we know of yet has. And that one is dated to the late 5th century as well too. So sort of what, whoever wrote the Gospel of Mark, we don't have any idea what that person really wrote. We just have copies of copies of copies of copies. So in this day and age, copying on a photocopier, you are much more likely to keep, good, clean copies. But back in the day, for those of us that are a little bit older, we may remember that, if you kept taking thing and then you copied that one and then you copied that one, pretty much you got to a place where who knew what the original really was, because it was hard to read. So what happens when scholars are working to put together a new translation of the scriptures, they sit down with all of what we know about all the different manuscript traditions and try to make their best guess about what the text really would have been. And again, if you look in there are often footnotes. If it's a responsible translation, there will be footnotes where often the translators will say, other authorities say X. And that means that there is another strong manuscript tradition that has an alternative reading, but that for particular reasons, whether it may be a theological reason or it may be that the weight of consensus has shifted, that what is in the actual body of the text is the scholarly consensus for how that should be translated. But it's important to maintain the possibility that there may be other ways to interpret that. One of the other pieces, of course, with reading the Gospels in English is that they weren't written in English. So whatever language they were written in, which is, again, Koine Greek, and is true in any kind of a translation from one language to another, it's very difficult to get a one-for-one translation. And so Greek has a great deal of variety. There are multiple words to describe love, for example, and if you've ever looked at the ending of the Gospel of John in the 21st chapter and that engagement with Peter and Jesus about, do you love me? There's actually a whole bunch of stuff that if you can't read the Greek, you may not know about what's really going on, because in English there's just one word that says love, but in Greek there are multiple words. And so, again, we can talk about that in more detail if that would be of interest to you during the questions. So. The other piece, of course, is that for about 1,500 years, so these are the 4 canonical Gospels. Again, these are the ones that are in all New Testaments, in all Christian traditions. So all different Christian traditions, depending on which branch of Christianity you're in, Roman Catholicism, Protestantism, Orthodox, there are differences amongst what we consider to be the Old Testament, but across the board, Christians agree that there are 27 books in the New Testament. We're going to talk about how that came to be. What we do know is that for nearly 1,500 years, so again, the first Gospels that we have copies of, begin to show up in the 4th and the 5th and the 6th centuries. Until 1945, we believe that although we knew that there were other Christian texts, other Gospels that existed, usually negatively, they show up in the writings of the church fathers, that those had been lost to history. But in 1945, a farmer near the Egyptian village of Nag Hammadi came across a treasure trove of 13 early Christian codices, and this is what they look like right there. So codex is a book shape. It's what we would think of as a book. So it looks like this, and as opposed to scroll. So this was the cheap way to do things. You could do it in papyrus as opposed to parchment, although these happen to be parchment, which is really, actually I take that back. These are papyrus. The freer book is parchment, and so it's a little bit sturdier. But there were 13 originally, but the farmer's mother thought it was trash. So she used one of the codexes to start the cooking fire over a period of time before they began to think, ooh, maybe we've got something here. So the 12 remaining codices contain 52 early, and I will call them, for want of a better term, Christian writings, some that are very fragmentary. Including a number of texts that use gospel in their title, so that Evangelium shows up as the title for the text. These are written in Coptic, which is an Egyptian language, but they and are dated to the 4th century. So the covers and so on, the writing, are some of the ways that we try to date manuscripts, and it all is appropriate to the 4th century. But we believe they represent a 4th century translation of earlier Greek manuscripts. So we suspect that there was a monastery near Nag Hammadi and that the monks there hid the codices after Athanasius, who was the bishop of Alexandria in the 4th century, sent out his Easter letter in the year 367 of the Common Era, telling his congregations that there were only 27 Christian texts that should be accepted as authoritative and that all others should be destroyed. So that is the oldest extant list that we have of the 27 books that we now think of as the New Testament. So we can establish that by that point, Alexandria was one of the major centers for Christianity in the ancient world. And so at least by that point in time, many Christian congregations had come to agree that those 27 books were the official ones. So the 52 texts in the Nag Hammadi collection are not they're not on Athanasius' list, and so that's why we think that they were saved, stored away, and hidden away to protect them. So in 1945, as these began to emerge, the first English translation, complete translation of all of the texts, was done in the 1970s, and I was talking with somebody earlier, so as you heard, I'm a graduate of the Claremont School of Theology and the Institute for Antiquities, and Christianity was headed by James Robinson, who is the translator of the Nag Hammadi collection, who spearheaded that whole effort. So it's very much woven into the DNA of one of my schools to be aware of that, as well as the Q material that I'll talk about in just a little bit as well too. One of the sort of big surprises as we began to read these texts in English was to discover that the Christianity of the Bible, the official Orthodox, and I use that term not in the sense of a big O to talk about a branch of Christianity, but in the small o of the right belief and right practice, that it turns out that Christianity actually is not anywhere near as monolithic as we used to think it was. That the book of Acts actually does not necessarily represent what actually happened at the start, but it is a community's understanding of what that might be. And so what we have in the last 40 years begun to think about is that there are multiple Christianities, and that those early Christianities, and that those early Christianities are unbelievably diverse. And the whole issue of Gnosticism and all that kind of stuff is not actually my area of specialty, but I can point you in the direction of people who can talk about that in a lot more detail than I can. Among these texts that showed up at Nag Hammadi is one text in particular, though, which is the Gospel of Thomas. So how many of you have heard about the Gospel of Thomas? Okay, a few of you. So one of the reasons this is important is it tends not to be terribly Gnostic, but it is simply a collection of 114 sayings of Jesus. And so the reason that this is important for the study of the canonical Gospels is because there is something called Q, which I alluded to before. Q is an abbreviation of the German word Quelle, which means source. And so Q is the shared source that the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, the authors, seem to have access to, which is material that is not found in the Gospel of Mark. So we know that Matthew and Luke had access to the Gospel of Mark because they borrow from that quite a bit. And then we have this shared set of teachings of Jesus, primarily, that Matthew and Luke share that are not included in the Gospel of Mark. And so for many centuries, biblical scholars have hypothesized that there was some other source, Q, some other Quelle, that those two Gospel writers had access to. And it's been a hot topic in it's the synoptic problem, how to understand the literary relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And what the discovery of the Gospel of Thomas did is to say, it is entirely likely that a sayings gospel circulated in the communities that Matthew and Luke were familiar with or came from, but that once those sayings got incorporated into the narrative of their Gospels, so they kind of married, if you will, Mark's Gospel with these additional teachings of Jesus, wove them together, that the expense and the challenge of continuing to copy that set of sayings was no longer necessary. And so people stopped keeping that one separate, and it was lost to history. So it's been reconstructed by scholars who have focused on Q, but the advantage in finding the Gospel of Thomas is that it seems as if that hypothesis actually has some standing and some bearing, that it's not just something that scholars came up with because they're crazy people. Okay, good. Let me take a little sip of water here. So that's kind of the background of the Gospels. What I want to do next is transition into thinking about this notion of historicity and literary license, and then how Gospels actually came to be written. So Bruce Lincoln is an historian of religion at the University of Chicago, and he offers a helpful way to think about different kinds of stories and the authority they have as truth. So he identifies 4 levels of story: fable, legend, epic, history, and myth. So he classifies stories into those 4 categories based on 3 criteria. First, whether the story makes a truth claim. So if not, it's a fable. If yes, it is a legend. So I come from the George Washington University. So one of the great stories about our founder is George as a young boy with a cherry tree and an axe, right? So that he chops it down. His father asks him, "Did you do it?" And he fesses up and says, "Yes, Dad, I did." So there's a story with a truth claim. It certainly was, was bandied about for many years that this actually happened. Well, so the second criteria is to see whether such a truth claim is seen as credible by the receiving audience. So for many, 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 many decades, centuries, whatever, children were taught that, right, as a way to learn to be truthful. Nowadays, historians of George Washington tell us that probably didn't happen. So it's no longer seen as having a credible truth claim. So it stays as a legend. It doesn't move up the chain to be understood to be history or epic, which is another way to talk about history. Then the third criteria is whether a story with a credible truth claim is seen as authoritative. And if so, then it is understood to be a myth. And if not, then it stays just as history. So for Christians, the canonical Gospels are believed to have a credible truth claim. It tells us something or tells people something about Jesus. And that moves the Gospels into the realm of epic and history. And they are also understood to be authoritative, which then moves them into the category of myth. So let me hasten to add that in religion, myth is understood to have this notion of authoritative truth claim rather than the notion of being a false tale that most people today in this day and age is the way in which they would understand the meaning of myth. So this is a huge challenge when you're teaching undergraduates, for example, about what is it that the New Testament is all about. So our challenge as scholars of religion is that when we talk about sacred texts, we're using the term myth in a way that points to sort of truth with a capital T, as opposed to truth with a small t that would represent data and facts that we could verify in this day and age. So I want to sort of make sure that you understand myth in that particular way. So given this notion of myth as a narrative with an authoritative truth claim, let me invite you to take a trip to Paris with me. Anybody been to Paris? Yeah. Okay, good. Ever walked into a bricolage shop? So this is a shop of the bricoleur. So if you have ever been to Paris and you've walked into that kind of a shop, I bet you have probably done it anyways, but here in the U.S., you understand immediately what Claude Lévi-Strauss is talking about or trying to convey by describing mythological thought or mythical thought, I should say, as bricolage. So arrayed on the shelves, jamming the aisles, crowding the windows are a heterogeneous mix of this and that. Nuts and bolts over in one corner, coffee makers and vacuums in another, gift wrapping left over from Christmas behind you. As you walk in, perhaps looking for an item with a specific purpose in mind, you're likely to discover that there are several other items available to you that you could use for this purpose that you hadn't even imagined that you could. So in Brookland, in the District of Columbia, there's the Brookland hardware store. Anybody ever had a chance to be in one of those old-fashioned where you've got exactly those kinds of things, right? So what Lévi-Strauss realized that, so with a bricoleur, you do have a settled universe of available items because there's only so much room in any given store. So you're going to have to make do with whatever is in that store. And so if you can't find what you really need, can you think about something else that you could use in place of that? And that the bricoleur sort of keeps all this together because these things might come in handy sometime. So if you or your parents or your grandparents grew up in the Depression in this country, you probably know some bricoleurs yourself. People who tuck things away on the same principle that you never know when you might need it. So, not asking for anybody to fess up, but can I just say that's a big challenge in my family. So. It's this notion of making something new and different out of what already exists that Lévi-Strauss applies to his structuralist understanding of mythical thinking. Wendy Doniger suggests, quote, "Structuralism gives us a pretty good idea of how myths are made. If you take an early story, more precisely a story that was recorded early, since no one knows when it was first told, and if you compare it with later tellings, it is as if the first story was dropped and broken into pieces, then put together again differently. Not wrongly, just differently. She goes on to say, in the ecology of narratives, recycling is a very old process indeed. Myths, like all things in constant use, such as truth in the Midrash, get broken and fixed again, lost and found, and the one who finds and fixes them, the handyman who recycles them, is what Levi-Strauss calls a bricoleur. Doniger further notes that the broken pieces, this is a quotation, the broken pieces are the atomic units of a myth, what Levi-Strauss called mythemes, unquote. So if we think of the canonical gospels, gospel writers as bricoleurs, we can see a common set of units that are included in each gospel, all four of them, not just the three that we've talked about as synoptic gospels, even though they may be put together differently. So the units include something about John the Baptist, something about Jesus' baptism, something about Jesus' teaching, which might be spoken words, verbal words, or might be miracle working. There's some kind of controversy with community leaders. There is something about a supper, something about a betrayal, something about his arrest, something about his trial, something about his crucifixion, something about his death, and there's some kind of post-death experience, which is not always the resurrection. So curiously, there are two other specific pieces that are included in all four Gospels, the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus' anointing. So it would seem that for the Christian myth, these 13 pieces are core elements that must be included in order for the narrative to be the gospel story, at least as far as the church was concerned in selecting what constituted the authoritative canonical set of narratives that it classified as gospels. So when you look at these 13 pieces and you think about the Nag Hammadi collection, they are so not there in most of the texts that call themselves gospels. So that's one of the reasons why they were excluded from the canon. It's intriguing to think about why the early church felt that these 13 pieces are so critical to the story, and it would be great to explore that, but we're not going to do it today. So today I want to focus, I think given the time, just on Matthew, and we can talk a little bit about the Gospel of Luke as well too, if we go somewhat fast, but I don't want your heads to explode completely. So I'm going to focus on these two because they are the most obvious bricoleurs among our gospel writers, and so they give us a kind of a clear window into this notion of how the gospels were crafted. By using Mark's gospel as a starting point, quoting or alluding to various parts of the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that was done in the 3rd century before the Common Era in Alexandria. And then, as I've already said, Matthew and Luke use Jesus' teachings that are collected in Q. But they also weave through their own material and they rearrange the shared material in different ways depending on what they are trying to communicate. So the two of them make it easy for us to see myth-making in work, at work, at least what Levi-Strauss would call that mythical thought process that went into telling the gospel story in a new way for a new audience that was somehow different from the audiences for which the materials were originally paired. So let me suggest that, that each of our gospel writers, in fact, across the entire New Testament, they are actually working on a set of 4 questions. So the first one is to answer the question, who is this Jesus of Nazareth? The second one is to ask, who are we in relation to him? A third question is to ask, who are we in relation to each other? And the fourth is to ask, who are we in relation to the world? So I would argue that each one of the New Testament writers, whether it's somebody writing an epistle or whether it's somebody writing a gospel or if it's John writing the Apocalypse, is in some form or fashion trying to answer these 4 questions. And some of the questions may get greater emphasis than others in a given writing, but that across the 27 books of the New Testament that these questions are in play. They're particularly obvious, and the emphasis on that first question, who is Jesus of Nazareth, is particularly critical for our gospel writers. So I'm going to use a model of the social imagination to help us think through some of the ways that we can think about how they get to answering these questions. And so that it looks like that. Woohoo! Boy, so isn't that exciting? So I'm going to walk you through it just a little bit. So it presumes that we live in multiple worlds at the same time. In our day and time, these worlds might include the world of our family, our professions, our workplace, our neighborhood, and the larger city, state, or country in which our neighborhood is located. We might also think of society and culture as worlds within which we are embedded. And normally we move back and forth seamlessly between these different worlds without thinking about it much. We know that we can act in a relaxed and informal way with our family and friends, and then shift effortlessly, into a more formal way as we stand in front of a business meeting or something like that. We may be completely unaware of our culture world until we travel away from home and suddenly discover that what we take for granted in terms of music or food or even clothing in the store are not to be found in our new location. It's particularly in situations where the things that we have taken for granted are no longer assured that we begin to realize that we do live in different worlds and that we may need some tools to help us negotiate the gaps between what we have taken for granted and what we are experiencing in this new setting. For the savvy bricoleur, these gaps or areas of collision and difference become opportunities to take advantage of the materials in our storehouse of bricolage, applying them in new ways to make sense of the new world, the new experience, or the new way of being and acting in the old world. So as you can see, there are 4 worlds that I think are particularly helpful for our task in exploring the bricolage of the Gospels and the Gospel writers. The first, I'm going to start over here, is the world of the community's life and practice. So this communal world, which is different for each one of our Gospel writers, is the audience for whom they are writing, that group of persons that they are trying to convince or persuade to understand who Jesus of Nazareth is in a particular way. To do so, they take advantage of the other 3 worlds, the society world in which the community is embedded. So again, this is part of how we try to discern, is, for example, Mark written in Rome or is it written in Syrophoenicia? Also the culture world, which is Greco-Roman culture, but also Jewish culture, and then finally the mythic world. And again, the primary mythic world that is involved in the Gospels is the Jewish mythic world, what it means to be the true Israel. But there are also hints that part of what the Gospel writers are challenging is the Greco-Roman mythic world that includes Caesar as a son of God and as a divine emperor. So as I said, there are sort of multiple layers in some of these worlds as well, too. The other piece to keep in mind is that there is a time difference. So the Gospels are all written a minimum of 50 years after Jesus lived, and so therefore they're talking into their community's experience, but thinking about this stuff that happened 50 years, 60, 70, maybe even 100 years earlier. So there's 2 different time layers going on when you think about what's going on in the Gospel.
Yeah. So with lifespan being quite short, then this would all be second, third hand, etc.
Exactly. So that's one of the reasons why we think that the Gospels appear when they do, is that the eyewitnesses and the people who knew the eyewitnesses are beginning to die, and then the trauma of the destruction of the temple sort of generates a sense of, wow, we really do need to think through what does this mean for us, and if we're going to pass this on, then we need to do that as well too. Yeah.
Was that the verbal telling from the beginning, or is this a much, much later thing?
Well, so again, so that's a really interesting question. I'm not quite sure how to answer that. There's a lot of debate about how literate in terms of writing are people as opposed to telling stories. What the Gospels represent, and again, one of the reasons why we think that there is a literary relationship between them is because the wording is so exact, which I would argue, and most scholars would argue, is actually not that possible in an oral tradition. So at least by the time that we get to 70 and the destruction of the temple, and certainly in Judaism, which is a very written literate, not that everybody could necessarily read, but certainly communities had written copies of the Torah scrolls. That it's a written culture as well as it is an oral culture. So with the gospel texts, while there may be some oral traditions, I think a lot of it is written. And then I also think, and again, this is something that is a relatively new idea, is not that the people who wrote the particular gospels were just editors who took the oral tradition and the Q and this, that, and the other, and somehow wove it together, but that they are authors in their own rights, that they have a particular vision of who Jesus is, and again, the answers to those other three questions, and that they are setting out to persuade their communities that their understanding and vision of who Jesus is and who the community ought to be in response to that is their own authorial creation. So I'm going to come down on the side of written more so than oral. So again, so you can sort of see how the worlds go together, and then they're linked by these other authorities. So foundational texts, which include what we've already talked about, the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Gospel of Mark, Q. And I would argue also some Greco-Roman sources as well, too. And I'm going to talk about one of those maybe, if we get through this at all quickly. The other piece is, those are the foundational texts. The notion of tradition is what's the history of interpretation of those foundational texts that help to create the mythic world, but that are seen by the communal world as having some bearing on their own experience. So today, if you were to walk into a Christian church, there would be a sense of history, 2,000 years of history of interpreting the biblical text. And that's part of the tradition. Another piece, though, is experience. So what is a particular community actually experiencing? And again, this is part of the way that we separate out Matthew and Mark and Luke and so on, and where they might have come from, is what does the community seem to be experiencing that is leading this particular author of the gospel to choose these particular things. So there's things that they're familiar with, that they take for granted, etc. And so that experience is critical as well. And then finally, reason, that part of the point of the Gospels is that they are argued in a particular way. They take advantage of both Jewish and Greco-Roman literary principles for persuasion and so on, and that part of the goal for the way in which the Gospels are written appears to be that they're designed to help communities adopt a new way of understanding and living in the world. So that reason is very much a part of what is going on in the texts. So let me take a quick version or a quick walk through something that's quite familiar to many people from the story, from the Sermon on the Mount. So this is from Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, and it's part of the Q material. So rather than sprinkling the Q material, again, these teachings or sayings of Jesus throughout his gospel as Luke does, Matthew has pulled the material together into 5 separate clusters and has put those throughout his gospel. So as the setting for the first cluster, what we call the Sermon on the Mount, and it's the longest chunk of the 5, Matthew describes Jesus going up on a mountain and sitting down to teach. Part of his teaching is about the law, in this case, the law of Moses, which Jesus, in Matthew's depiction, claims to have come to fulfill. And you can find that in chapter 5 of Matthew. By having 5 clusters of material, which scholars equate with the 5 books of Moses, and in bringing to his listeners this new interpretation of the law, describing Jesus' posture in a way similar to that of Moses, Matthew paints a picture of Jesus as the fulfillment of Moses' prophecy in Deuteronomy 18, that God will raise up a prophet like me, like Moses, from among your own people. So to paint this picture, if you think about this in relation to the social imagination model, Matthew has drawn upon the mythic world of Israel, in which Moses is understood as the great lawgiver. Moses is the one who receives God's law on the mountaintop and who brings it down to the people. Matthew's also drawn upon Israel's foundation texts such as Deuteronomy, Exodus, and Leviticus, the Torah, in order to have Jesus reinterpret specific instances of the law. And here is this phrase that shows up in this particular section of the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard it said, but I say to you. By reinterpreting the tradition, Matthew creates a different set of standards for his community's life and practice, which both acknowledge and yet intensify the provisions of the law that helped to create the mythic world of Israel. And so, in the social imagination model, how I would see Matthew using he uses the mythic world of Israel, he uses its foundational texts and also the tradition of interpretation of those texts, as well as what he is proposing as new interpretations in order to shape the life and practice of the communal world, which is his own community. So I hope it's possible to see there how the social imagination can be useful in identifying elements underlying an author's argument. And so this helps to provide a window into what we think the gospel writer may be concerned about. So you can argue that in this small example of the Sermon on the Mount, that how Jesus measures up against Moses is of concern to the community. And that Matthew is proposing that not only is Jesus like Moses, but that he is greater than Moses because he doesn't receive the law from God. He tells you what the new law is. So presumably there are Jews in Matthew's group who are concerned about Jesus' authority and whether it is as great as Moses' authority when it comes to the law. I want to take a look at one of the women's stories, and I would argue that each of the canonical Gospels, again, interestingly enough, has a story that shows up at about the middle point of the Gospel that tells us something about who Jesus is, but also something about who the community is. And in the Gospel of Mark, it's the story of the Syrophoenician woman. And in the Gospel of Matthew, it's the Canaanite woman. And then and I would argue, and this is why I think actually the Gospel of John knows both Mark and Matthew, that the story of the Samaritan woman in the Gospel of John is actually another version of this story, that the author of the Gospel of John sees what Matthew does to Mark's story and turns that into the Samaritan woman story in John 4. So I'm not going to go there today, but in the Gospel of Luke, it is actually the story of the bent-over woman. Yep. Mm-hmm.
So these authors are all appealing kind of to the prospective audiences, sort of? Mm-hmm. So like that's why they're all like a different person, like different community.
Right, exactly. So again, none of our New Testament writers sat down and said, hey, I'm going to be in the New Testament someday. Let me see what I can do. So each author is writing separately for his or her community. Again, we don't actually know who most of these folks are. But we presume, patriarchy being what it is, that they're all male, but you never know. So again, the author of the Gospel of Matthew has access to some version of the Gospel of Mark. And again, we think this because it would be very tough to get the precise wording that we have. And Matthew actually uses about 95% of the Gospel of Mark. Luke only uses about 56% of the Gospel of Mark in the way in which he takes advantage of the Markan text. So actually, if we didn't actually have copies of the Gospel of Mark, it would be a lot harder to posit from Matthew and Luke that a Gospel of Mark actually existed, because there's less coherence or less exactness between the way in which Matthew uses Mark and Luke uses Mark than there is with the Q material. So if we didn't actually have copies of the Gospel of Mark, we would not know that there was a Gospel of Mark, interestingly enough. So it's all about the math. So the basic outline of the story of the Syrophoenician woman goes like this. So Jesus has gone to the region of Tyre and Sidon, so he's outside of Israel, north of Galilee, where he encounters a foreign woman who asks Jesus to heal her daughter. Initially, Jesus refuses, but then based on a continued conversation with the woman, he acquiesces and the woman's daughter is healed. So that's the basic outline of both of these two stories. The ways in which Matthew has edited Mark's version goes like this. So in Matthew's version, the woman is described as a Canaanite rather than as Syrophoenician. In Matthew's version, the disciples are present, and they are not present in Mark's version of the story. And furthermore, in Matthew's version, the disciples try to get Jesus to deal with the woman. In Matthew's version of the story, Jesus ignores the woman not once but twice. The woman describes Jesus as Lord 3 times in the Gospel of Matthew. She also calls him Son of David, which is what the people who know who Jesus is in the Gospel of Matthew call him: demons, Gentiles, and the Canaanite woman. In Matthew's version, Jesus says he is only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And then finally, it's the woman's faith and not her clever speech that wins the day for Jesus in Matthew's version as opposed to Mark's version. So a little bit more about why I think this is a critical story that helps us know something about both Jesus and the community that Matthew is dealing with. Matthew's the only author in the New Testament who uses the term Canaanite. So his choice in using that and selecting that term clearly has to have some kind of purpose. Tradition criticism, which is a tool used in the study of sacred texts, reminds us that in the Hebrew Bible, Canaanites are the persons who inhabit the Promised Land before the Israelites conquer it on their return from Egypt. The prophets, another part of the Hebrew Bible, continually remind Israel not to follow Canaanite ways, which includes the worship of gods other than Yahweh in most instances. And perhaps the most famous Canaanite woman in the scriptures is Jezebel, the wife of Ahab and the daughter of the king of Sidon, who convinces her husband to allow the worship of her gods alongside the worship of Yahweh. Now, I will say we meet Jezebel again in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, not as a Canaanite specifically, but this particular woman will be called out of control, similar to the way in which Jezebel in the Old Testament was identified. The Revelation's Jezebel is also identified as the one who seduces the church in Thyatira to follow practices that are not in keeping with the author of Revelation's understanding of appropriate Christian teaching. So in another Jewish context, Philo of Alexandria, who lives approximately the same time as Jesus in the first part of the first century, he uses Canaan and Canaanite allegorically to describe wickedness in several of his writings. So these uses of the adjective Canaan or Canaanite, which Matthew presumably expected to be part of the mythic and cultural repertoire of his audience, suggests that his use of the term, in place of simply Gentile or Syrophoenician, which is what he finds in his Markan source, is designed to heighten the conflict between Jesus and the woman that is recorded in the story. She's not just a Gentile like the Roman centurion who earlier has a positive experience with Jesus. She is a Canaanite, and yet she identifies Jesus as Lord. The same word is used in Greek in the Old Testament whenever you see Lord God, that is kurios is used there, as well as with son of, and she also calls him, the Canaanite woman also calls Jesus son of David. When Jesus ignores her, she prostrates herself before him and again asks him as Lord to help her. And then in her final response, Jesus ignores her for a second time. She both calls him Lord and then alludes to Jesus as Lord by saying that it is the crumbs from the master's table, from the Lord's table, that she's prepared to eat, not the children's table, which is how Mark has it. And so in all of that, Jesus finally wakes up and says, wow, this woman really believes in me. So it's her faith, her acceptance, and her belief in the power of one who is an enemy of her gods, not her cleverness, that wins the day and persuades Jesus to grant her wish that her daughter would be healed. So why might Matthew have made these changes to the Markan story? So I have argued elsewhere that the story of the Canaanite woman is the pivot point on which Matthew's gospel turns so that his community can become the community of the Great Commission, which is to go and make disciples of all nations. A frequently observed theme in this gospel is the Gentile scene, beginning with, or the Gentile theme, which begins with the genealogy of Jesus, which includes Gentile women, includes in the birth narrative, Matthew is the one where the Magi come. There's no shepherds, no angels, just foreigners who come to recognize Jesus. And you see that throughout the course of the gospel. And it's the Gentiles who are often more responsive to Jesus in a positive way than other Israelites, other Jews are. So the thing that's a little bit odd is that here in this moment where he himself is confronted by a Gentile woman, it seems as if he's going to have kind of a crisis, if you will. So in calling this woman not just a Gentile, but calling her a Canaanite, Matthew is intensifying the emphasis on the woman's surprising faith in Jesus by stretching out the time between the woman's first request of Jesus and his final answer. So the Markan story goes very, very quickly. In Matthew, you think, oh my gosh, what's this guy going to do? In bringing in the disciples to support her plea, not because it's a just request or not because it's the right thing to do. They want him to deal with her because she's bugging them, is what it boils down to. Matthew is stretching out the tension in his hearer's mind by raising the possibility that Jesus will not be able to expand his understanding of his role as Messiah to go beyond the lost sheep of the house of Israel in order to include the Gentiles, even though he has consistently praised their faithfulness over against the unfaithfulness of the Jews up until this point in the gospel. So I would suggest that Matthew is arguing that through Jesus' own struggle to come to grips with this idea of going to those beyond the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and his final acceptance of his new definition of his role, that Jesus becomes a model that Matthew's community can also follow, in showing that Jesus is struggling with the ambiguity of the positive response that the Gentiles are having to their ministry. Matthew may be affirming the struggle his own community is confronting as they try to make sense of the increasingly mixed nature of their community. In seeing that Jesus finally says yes to the woman, Matthew may be encouraging his community to say yes to the increasing numbers of Gentiles. So there are a couple of other things that I think the social imagination model helps us understand. And it goes back to that notion of that woman Jezebel who is practicing immorality and so on and so forth. There is a theme in Greco-Roman literature and also in Jewish literature about the captive foreign woman. So Deuteronomy 21 talks about how you should handle women who are captured on the battlefield, foreigners. And there are ways in which over time in the rabbinic tradition where this captive foreign woman becomes a symbol for Greco-Roman culture. And the rabbis, Rabbi Akiba in particular, is dismayed that his community is beginning to be open and welcoming to Greco-Roman culture. And so it seems as though Matthew's community may be struggling with this same sort of idea. Is it okay for us to eat potluck down with the folks down the street who may have gotten their meat from the meat market, which is based on food sacrificed to idol? This is one of the things that Paul deals with in his letters as well, too. So how do we understand who this foreign woman, this metaphor for Greco-Roman culture, how do we work with that image in order to understand who we are and what we are meant to be? So by the time we get to the 4th century, Christians are going to see that as positive. Jerome is going to use that as a positive image, and that it becomes, the Greco-Roman culture becomes a way in which he is able to articulate for what is now essentially a completely Gentile religion or non-Jewish religion, that it's worth it to him to take advantage of it. Jerome says, "Is it surprising that I too, admiring the fairness of her form and the grace of her eloquence, desire to make that secular wisdom which is my captive and my handmaid a matron of the true Israel? Or that shaving off and cutting away all in her that is dead, whether this be idolatry, pleasure, error, or lust, I take her to myself clean and pure, and beget by her servants for the Lord Sabaoth." So this is what Jerome in the 4th century is going to say about Greco-Roman culture. So let me close here by saying that I think one of the reasons Matthew uses this image of the Canaanite, of this foreign woman, in reworking his mark and source, is indeed as an attempt to lay the foundation that will help to persuade his community that they are indeed the community of the Great Commission. So at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, and this Gospel alone, Jesus will challenge these same disciples to go and make disciples of all the nations, even presumably this Canaanite woman and her daughter. So Matthew has found in his bricolage shop not just the Septuagint with its marvelous expectations of a Messiah who is to come, not just the Gospel of Mark with his brisk story of Jesus being claimed by God to fulfill those expectations as an unusual type of Messiah, and not just Q with its pithy sayings and teachings about how followers of Jesus should act in relation to him, to each other, and to the world. But he's also found amongst the odds and ends in his literary storehouse materials from the Greco-Roman culture in which his community is embedded. As a savvy and skilled bricoleur, he has found a way to retell the story of the foreign woman by using these odds and ends in a new way, in a way that is designed to help his community ultimately move out beyond the house of Israel and into the whole world. And so with that, let me just finish up by saying that I hope you've had a chance to see a little bit about how, at least as biblical scholars, we understand the notion of historicity as well as literary license and how the Gospels were crafted. I want to thank you for taking this journey with me and for thinking with me aloud about these 4 questions. So, as you've hopefully seen, history in the Gospels is not exactly history as we think about it in the 21st century. Sadly, there was nobody there with an iPhone or an iPad to record Jesus' work. There was no Twitter feed, no Facebook page on which to post his successes. What we do have, from at least half a century later, are groups for whom Jesus and what he represents are critically important to their self-understanding of who they are as a community embedded within the political, social, religious, and economic structures of the Roman Empire. We also find that these communities appear to be engaged in reflection in their particular historical moment of what it means to be a follower of this Jesus of Nazareth, with at least one talented person in each community utilizing the mythic, cultural, and social resources that are available to that community to imagine their lives differently by telling the community's story, its myth, remember its authoritative, credible truth claim, in new and different ways that are designed to open up new possibilities for how they can understand themselves and their identity. Because of their imaginative effort, later communities of followers of Jesus are also able to have reimagined themselves in light of the social, historical, and cultural context in which they found themselves. And that process still goes on. If you were to walk into a Christian church tomorrow, preachers are continually seeking to find answers to those 4 questions that I've raised. The problem is that in our 21st century world, that we are likely to apply modern standards of history, truth, and scientific knowledge to texts that have no concept of those constructs. And so we seek to make gospel truth out of texts that had no notions that they were sacred in any way. So thank you so much for your time, and look forward to more questions. So, JD, yes?
NRSV, I think, is New Revised Standard Version?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah,
So
that's correct.
going off of that, there's a zillion English translations of the Bible
Right,
available on the bookshelf. In your opinion, which is the most accurate one and why?
None.
So I would actually, I would go with the NRSV primarily, or there's a new translation that's just come out called the Common English Bible. And again, both of those, will tell you what their editorial approach was. And in both instances, the goal is to be as accurate as possible, keeping in mind the reality of what it takes to read English that makes sense. Because sort of how Greek grammar works is not the same as how English grammar works. So again, so there's not only are there different meanings for words and so on, but in both of those are both intended to be used for scholarly purposes as well as for sort of common lay people. So I would go either with the NRSV. I will say that the bent over woman text, which is from Luke's gospel, is actually, this is my own translation. So this is how I would take it. So you could take a look at this and compare it to some other translations. Great, yes, please.
Is the repeated use of the word Lord in Matthew, is that the beginnings of introducing the concept of the Trinity?
I would argue that the Trinity is a very late thing. It actually doesn't show up until the 3rd century that people even really care about it. So we read it back into it. So in the Gospel of John, when he uses I am, so that's again, that particular word is the translation of what is the name of God in the Hebrew Bible. So in John's Gospel, when Jesus says, I am the resurrection, or I am the light, or I am the this or the that, the allusion is to thinking of Jesus as divine, but again, in the Gospel of John, Jesus is already the cosmic Christ, so he is the incarnation who exists before. But the Trinity as a concept is actually quite a late breaking issue. The biblical texts themselves don't really care. Does that answer your question? Okay. Over here, yes, please, ma'am.
If Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John were contemporaries of Christ,
They were not.
they were not. So weren't they the disciples that were
They
at
were
the,
not.
The Last Supper and all of that?
They were no. So the authors of the gospel, we have no idea who they are actually. Names get associated with them at the end of the 2nd century. So, and they are associated with people that we do read about in the gospel stories, but we have no idea who wrote the gospels.
Okay, well, so none of the original. I was wondering how
did the names get? They didn't. Well, we don't know if they did. Maybe it's miraculous, but yeah. But the names. So one of the things about ancient writing is that. That if there are important people in sort of your school, your group or community, that you might attribute a saying to or a piece of writing to somebody in order to lend it some authenticity or some authority. So again, in Mark's gospel, because Peter is clearly the lead disciple in that gospel, John Mark was. Tradition held that he was Peter's secretary, and so therefore it got associated with Mark. In Matthew's gospel, it tells the story of the tax collector named Matthew, who becomes one of the disciples. So that's how he gets associated with that. Luke, because it's Luke and Acts, and there is, sorry, I apologize, that's my phone that's doing that beepy thing, Luke is a companion of Paul, and it used to be thought that there was more medical stuff in Luke than other Gospels. That's actually not true on a percentage basis. But anyway, so that's how Luke gets associated with the Luke in Gospels because of the Luke-Acts connection. And then with John, the beloved disciple is the one who is referred to as the author of it. That person is never named, but again, we have this vision of James and John, the brother of James, who's the son of Zebedee, as being the person who's standing at the foot of the cross. So it's all tradition. We don't know who wrote the gospel.
Okay, so Paul didn't really write Acts, or
no, Paul had nothing to do with Acts. And what how Paul himself talks about his early history and what the book of Acts says about the early history has little to no bearing on itself. Yep. Let me go back over to this corner.
You're suggesting that each gospel writer had access to maybe a half dozen gospels and some seemingly more authentic than others for the same reasons that you were talking about now, which is commonalities. And then what I'm trying to infer from that is if they were aware of these differences and the writers then could empower their personal faith engine to write a gospel truth for their time and community? Is that really what you're arguing?
I'm not, could you,
In other words, what I'm trying to say, if it's the case that, okay, if I was presented with the Encyclopedia Britannica in the days when we had a printed version, and I wanted to write my improved version, I would probably hew very closely because I know that was authoritatively written. But if I had the Encyclopedia Britannica and Encyclopedia America, I had like 10 different encyclopedias. 2 of them looked very much the same, but the others differed. Then when I pulled it together, I could argue that the truth, no one encyclopedia has the truth, so I can fill in any place where I have doubts, I can imagine what is the correct filling, and I won't feel guilty. I haven't distorted the words of God.
yes. So what I'm saying is, again, keeping in mind that none of our gospel writers, and actually really none of the writers of the New Testament sat down and thought, oh, I'm going to be writing a sacred text here. What they did was they said, you know what, the Gospel of Mark is great as far as it goes. It gives us this kind of vision of Jesus going from Galilee to Jerusalem. It doesn't actually include in its original form a resurrection appearance, which is fine if you're in a community that's relatively close to the destruction of the temple and you're pretty well convinced that Jesus is going to be back next week because the end of the world is here. But you get 10, 15, 20 years out from the destruction of the temple, and you know what? Jesus hasn't come back. People are starting to die. How are we going to live in the meantime? And so you have to think through, how do we understand ourselves? And when we have no idea, it turns out, whether the end of the world actually has come. So you begin to get resurrection appearances. You begin to get ways in which each gospel writer, Matthew and Luke and John, deal with what do we do after Jesus goes away from us. So in Matthew, Jesus is going to meet them up on the hill in Galilee, and he's going to give them the Great Commission. Go and make disciples of all nations, and I will be with you to the end of the age. Well, clearly the end of the age can't come until we've made disciples of all nations. So that's Matthew's solution to the when will Jesus come back. Luke is going to write a whole other book. He's going to get to Jesus' ascension, and Jesus is going to say, you will be my disciples in Jerusalem, Samaria, Judea, and to the ends of the earth. So again, they're going to get to the ends of the earth at the end of the second book. In the Gospel of John, in one of the resurrection appearances, Jesus is going to breathe the Holy Spirit on them, so we don't need to worry about Pentecost or anything like that. Jesus has given them the power that they need in that moment. So in each of the communities, there are different issues that are going on that speak to different things. And we can see that Mark was unsettling to people because people added later on resurrection appearances, that we think that the original ending of the gospel is actually as the women run away terrified and don't say, from the empty tomb. So there's no Jesus involved there. So again, my contention would be that again, the folks that write the Gospels, again, what they're trying to do is write a life of Jesus for their community that makes sense in their time, and that may give hope, or may give a sense of understanding, or a sense of, if Jesus had to do that, we can do it too, that makes sense in their context. So I love your analogy of the encyclopedias. Does that help answer your question? Okay, great. Yes, sir, please.
Along this line, given the proliferation of Gospels that didn't make it into the Bible, and the factual massaging that goes on the ones that did get into the Bible, what are the chances that there was really an historical character that we would recognize as a biblical Jesus?
Well, the Jesus Seminar has a whole, has spent a long time trying to figure this out. We continually go through cycles of the quest for the historical Jesus. I think there has to have been somebody, somewhere, sometime, that made enough of an impact on a group of people that they felt that their lives were transformed in a way that they told other people about, and other people experienced that, and so on and so forth. So now there are some non-biblical references to an historical person named Jesus. Again, Pliny's is one of the places. Tacitus talks about it in the Annals. Josephus mentions it. So there's got to have been somebody, I would say, probably, that existed historically. But what else do we know about him? All that, I would argue, is sort of up for grabs. Please.
Well, before I ask my question, I just want to say, I did read, though, that Josephus, that none of the editions of Josephus before 1850 don't mention Jesus. 1850, suddenly somebody put it in there. The question I was going to ask was, does there seem to be any historical connection with people that wrote those Dead Sea Scrolls? Did any of their doctrines get adopted into Christianity, or are they completely separate?
There is ongoing scholarly conversation about that. In terms of, well, obviously a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls are actually scrolls of the Hebrew Bible. It's actually more likely that John the Baptist may have had some Essene characteristics. Some of how he is described is more in line with what with some of the descriptions about the ascetic nature of the community. So there probably was some cross-pollination, but it isn't completely clear.
Because I read all the Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't know why I'm not that interested in religion, but I noticed that when they wanted to say somebody was a member of their community, they would say, he's the Son of God. And you say, oh, he's the Son of God. Well, maybe this is how got into Christianity.
Well, Son of God is very common actually in the Hebrew Bible as well too. So the king is the Son of God. People who do well are a son of God. So it's not unusual. It's also a part of Greco-Roman culture. The emperor is the Son of God. So there are lots of sons of God. There are lots of sons of God running around. So it's not. It is not just a title reserved just for Jesus in a way. Although Christians tend to sort of read that back into it. Please.
So I've got two questions there. So these people who wrote these did not intend them to be like the word of God per se, like I'm like speaking for God, like how modern Christianity views them.
That's correct.
Okay, and then the other question I have is, so Jesus and his movement were more just kind of like societal movement within Judaism at the time, like not really like, oh, let's change all the doctrine and stuff, but like we need to interpret it better maybe. I mean, like so he wasn't really like, okay, hey, I'm the Son of God and let's make a new truthful religion here kind of thing.
No, it appears at the earliest layers to be very much a social movement within Christianity about reinterpreting. I'm sorry, did I say? Sorry, my bad. Thank you. Within, I was thinking about all those reform movements later on and after the Protestant Reformation. So it's not unlike the Protestant Reformation, actually. You could argue that all those different denominations that show up are, so again, in the first century and in the sort of in Hellenistic culture, there's sort of struggling with all this multicultural, what does it mean to be Israel? What does it mean to be Jewish? What does it mean to be whatever? With the Roman occupation, how can we understand ourselves? And what the Jesus movement appears to be doing is to be exploring or looking at how can we work to create the vision of a just society that we read about in the prophets.
Okay, and he never said, I am the Son of God. Like I know how that you just said they use that term a lot for people like meaning like a person who's doing well or is doing good things. So he never like intended himself to be the like the kind of Trinity aspect?
The Trinity, absolutely not. In the Gospels, again, the church does not come to any agreement on the doctrine of the Trinity until the 4th century. The church doesn't even come to any agreement on whether Jesus is human or divine until the 4th century. So there's several councils that try to figure out how do we understand all this. So he's kind of a cool guy, yeah. Cool guy with whatever. And again, I would argue that there is clearly there's something about him that made a difference in people's lives, that they were prepared to continue to tell the story. So there's lots of messiahs in the 1st century, because you've got this Roman occupation. So lots of people claim to be the Messiah, and so there had to be something different, because this one guy where it stuck. That people, whatever it was, it stuck in a way that it didn't for all those other tens, if not hundreds, of people who claim to be the Messiah. Because again, this notion of how can we get rid of Rome, et cetera, et cetera. So whatever that experience was that so transformed people's lives, and I would argue continues to transform people's lives today, in some form or fashion.
So modern Christianity is on really, really shaky ground, in other words, theologically. So.
Well, it stands on the tradition of theological discussion and debate of the first 4 centuries. What I would say is we do a bad job of teaching Sunday school to sort of understand, that this is a developmental process and not just that there is the inerrant word of Scripture. Or as I discovered in, you want me to stop? Okay, great.
But you always stay and talk to the speaker.
Yes, that's great. Okay. So, anyways, but I read on a blog the inherent word of God for somebody who was, I think, meaning the inerrant word of God. But anyway, so that was my little. I thought, well, maybe it is the inherent word of God. So please, yes.
I was wondering, since you mentioned the Jesus Seminar and also the End of the World, Albert Schweitzer characterized Jesus as an apocalyptic prophet, in which a lot of critical scholars accepted. But the Jesus Seminar seems to reject that model. I was curious, what is the view now of critical scholars? Was basically Jesus saying the world's going to end pretty soon and I'm going to be responsible for it, or are they backing away from that now?
I think a lot of scholars would argue that that apocalyptic or the apocalyptic nature probably doesn't happen until the destruction of the temple, and so that it is a later addition. There are lots of, so apocalyptic is what people feel when they're being threatened, and you could argue that Judaism in the 1st century, throughout the whole period of the 1st century, is feeling threatened because of dealing with Rome. So Rome comes in 63 BCE, and and it seemed like a good idea at the time, but it turned out it was really not a good idea. So all of a sudden, the Hasmonean monarchy is over with, and you've got people who are trying to figure out what does it mean to be sort of under Roman occupation. And Pilate is not the happy, oh, please let me not ruin your life kind of guy that we see in the Gospels. He's really a pretty vicious character who gets recalled from by Rome because he's such a problem. So sort of the leadership that's assigned to oversee Judea in particular is really not very good. So you begin to feel like you want apocalypse. You want God to be on your side. It's a good thing. Yay! yeah, exactly. So in that sense, there are a number of movements that have that. It just, and again, there's a lot of scholarly debate. I come from Claremont, so we sort of err on the side of Jesus as a cynic philosopher school more so than an apocalyptic school, which seems much later and therefore associated with the destruction of the temple, with the war, all that kind of stuff in the late 60s and the 70s. So that's the thought. I did actually go. So the Westar Institute, and again I've put it here. So the Jesus Seminar is a part of the Westar Institute, and actually that's what the beeping is from my phone. They're tweeting out their current, they have a conference going on right now about sex and religion in the first century. So that's what those tweets are all about, just saying. But if you want to find out what they are all about, then you can go to the weststarinstitute.org, and that you can see what the Jesus Seminar decided in terms of what the actual, what were the things that Jesus was most likely to have said, what were the deeds that Jesus was most likely to have done. There are not very many of them. Out of all the things that they looked at, but that's a place to look at it. If you're interested in reading any of the Gnostic texts, you can go find them either at gnosis.org, which has all of the Nag Hammadi texts in particular, or earlychristianwritings.com, which is a great free resource that has English translations of all of the early Christian writings. There's also earlyjewishwritings.com, which is a sister site that includes what we know of as Christian writings outside the canon, and also Jewish writings outside the canon. And then again, if you want to know what I said about the bent over woman, you can read my book. So, because it's all about there. So anyways, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking your Saturday afternoon with me.